They always tell themselves they're fine after walking away. They convince their mind that distance is peace, that silence is safety, that losing you was necessary for their freedom. In the beginning, it even feels true. Their chest loosens, the pressure disappears, and they finally breathe without having to explain themselves to anyone. They call it relief. Know what they're really feeling is emotional anesthesia. The absence of you feels calm only because their nervous system has shut down again. And this is where the story always begins. Not with regret, not with pain, but with a false sense of victory that slowly rots from the inside. They don't come back because they miss you immediately. They come back because this relief expires. And when it does, everything they buried starts clawing its way up at once. You were not just someone they loved, you were the mirror that reflected the parts of them they didn't want to face. And when you disappeared, that mirror didn't shatter, it waited. At first, they distract themselves. They stay busy, they scroll, they work longer hours, they laugh louder with people who don't ask deep questions. They tell themselves they're better off now, that the connection was too intense, too demanding, too much. But here's what they don't admit out loud. The intensity only scares people who feel deeply but don't know how to stay. You didn't overwhelm them, you activated them. And activation feels like danger to someone who learned early that closeness leads to loss, disappointment, or suffocation. So they run, and when they run, they expect you to stay frozen in the place they left you, still waiting, still aching, still emotionally available, just in case they change their mind. That belief is what keeps them comfortable at first. The idea that you'll always be there, quietly loving them from a distance, is what allows them to avoid guilt. But time passes, and you don't chase, you don't collapse, you don't beg. And that's when the first crack forms. The crack doesn't feel dramatic. It feels subtle. It shows up in quiet moments when they reach for their phone without thinking, then stop. It shows up when something good happens and there's no one who truly understands why it matters. It shows up at night when distractions fade and their body remembers what their mind tried to forget. They don't label this feeling as missing you yet. They call it boredom, loneliness, stress, anything except the truth. But the truth doesn't need a label to exist. It lives in their nervous system, in the way their chest tightens when they think of emotional safety, in the way memories of you surface uninvited. You laughing, you trying, you waiting, you choosing them, even when they made it hard. These memories don't hurt at first, they just linger. And for an avoidant, lingering emotions are far more threatening than explosive ones, because lingering means they can't outrun it forever. Slowly, the silence they once craved becomes unbearable. The freedom they defended so fiercely starts to feel empty. They begin to notice that connections feel shallow now, conversations feel thin, and no one quite reaches them the way you did. Not because you were perfect, but because you were present. You stayed emotionally available in a way that felt unfamiliar and overwhelming to them. And now that presence is gone, this is where regret quietly starts to form, not as panic, but as comparison. They compare everyone to you without meaning to. They look for your patience in others and don't find it. They look for your understanding and realize how rare it was. They look for your emotional consistency and suddenly understand what they lost. But instead of running back immediately, they freeze. Because acknowledging regret means acknowledging responsibility. And responsibility threatens the identity they built around independence and emotional distance. So they sit with it. They suppress it. They try to convince themselves they'll feel better tomorrow. Then comes the moment that truly breaks them. It's not when they miss you. It's when they realize you're no longer waiting. There's a shift they can feel, but can't explain. Your energy is different. You're quieter, grounded, detached, not cold, not angry, just no longer reaching. This terrifies them more than conflict ever did. Because conflict meant connection was still alive. Detachment means you might be gone for real, and suddenly the power dynamic they relied on disappears. They're no longer the one pulling away. They're the one standing outside, unsure if the door is still open. This is when regret sharpens into pain. Not the dramatic kind they know how to dismiss, but the humbling kind that sinks into their bones. They replay moments they once brushed off. The times you tried to talk and they shut down. The times you needed reassurance and they withdrew. The moments you chose vulnerability and they chose distance. And now those moments don't feel small anymore. They feel irreversible. This is where the emotional collapse begins. The part they avoided feeling hits all at once. Guilt, longing, fear, loss. They realize you weren't asking for too much. You were asking them to show up, and they didn't know how. They didn't know how to stay present without feeling exposed. They didn't know how to love without controlling the distance. And now they're left with the unbearable awareness that you loved them in the way they always wanted to be loved, but never believed they deserved. This realization doesn't make them strong. It makes them fragile. They start imagining you happy without them. They imagine someone else receiving the version of you they took for granted, someone else benefiting from your growth, your patience, your emotional depth. And that thought does something to them. It humbles them. It strips away their defenses. For the first time, they're not running from connection. They're afraid of losing it forever. When they finally show up again, it's not dramatic or confident. It's hesitant, careful, almost unsure of their right to even be there. The person who returns is not the one who left feeling relieved. This version is heavier, quieter, and emotionally exposed in ways they don't know how to manage. They don't come back because they feel powerful. They come back because they feel broken open, because the distance didn't heal them, it revealed them. And standing in front of you again, they're no longer avoiding the truth. They're drowning in it. They don't return with confidence. They return with a quiet urgency. They don't fully understand themselves. Every step toward you feels like stepping out of armor. They were their whole life. The distance that once felt safe now feels like a punishment. They gave themselves. Their body remembers before their mind does. Their chest tightens. Their throat closes. Their heart races, not with excitement, but with fear. Not fear of you, but fear of what they might finally have to feel if you look at them the same way you used to. They rehearse what they'll say, then delete it. They open conversations in their head that never make it out of their mouth. Because the truth is simple and terrifying at the same time, they don't know how to approach someone. They hurt without hiding. And yet, hiding is no longer an option. They already tried disappearing. It didn't save them. They start small. A message that looks casual on the surface, a check-in that pretends it has no emotional weight. They tell themselves it's just curiosity, just nostalgia, just seeing how you're doing. But underneath that calm tone is panic, because they're not just reaching out to you. They're reaching out to the version of themselves they abandoned when they walked away. They're hoping you won't see the cracks. They're hoping you won't notice how different they feel. But you do. You always did. And the moment they sense that you're not rushing toward them, something inside them drops. The old pattern isn't working anymore. You're not chasing. You're not over-explaining. You're not asking for reassurance. And that's when the real fear kicks in. Because for the first time, they're not in control of the distance. What they feel next isn't anger or defensiveness. It's grief. Grief for what they lost. Grief for the version of the connection that could have existed if they had stayed present. Grief for how safe it felt to be loved by you before fear took over. Avoidants don't process grief the way others do. It doesn't come out as tears right away. It comes out as restlessness, insomnia, chest pressure, a constant sense that something is wrong, but they can't fix it. They realize they didn't just lose you, they lost the place where they felt understood without being forced to perform. And now, standing on the outside, they see what they destroyed by refusing to show up when it mattered. This grief humbles them in a way nothing else could. They start replaying the past with painful clarity, not the fights, not the tension, but the moments of softness they once minimized. The way you waited for them to open up, the way you didn't pressure them, even when you were hurting, the way you adjusted yourself to make them comfortable, even when it cost you. Back then, those moments felt invisible to them. Now they glow like warnings they ignored. They see how much emotional labor you carried without complaint, how often you chose patience over walking away, and the weight of that realization crushes them because they finally understand something that terrifies them. You loved them in a way they didn't know how to reciprocate. Not because you asked too much, but because they were emotionally underdeveloped. And once they see that, they can't unsee it. This is where regret sharpens into desperation. Not the loud kind that begs immediately, but the quiet kind that destabilizes everything they thought they knew about themselves. They question their choices, their identity, their belief that independence meant emotional distance. They realized too late that what they called freedom was actually avoidance, and what they called strength was actually fear. And now that fear has a face, it looks like you moving on without bitterness. It looks like you choosing peace instead of proving your worth. It looks like you no longer needing them to validate your value. That's what breaks them. Not rejection, not silence, but the possibility that you healed without them. They start imagining conversations that may never happen. They imagine telling you everything they couldn't say before, how overwhelmed they felt, how scared closeness made them, how they didn't know how to ask for space without disappearing. But imagination isn't enough anymore. The pain has grown too loud. So when they finally try to be honest, it comes out messy, incomplete, awkward. They don't know how to speak from vulnerability without apologizing for existing. They stumble over their words. They downplay their emotions, then contradict themselves. But beneath all of it is something real, something raw. For the first time, they're not performing detachment. They're standing exposed, unsure if you'll even want to hear what they have to say. They notice how different you are now, not colder, just steadier. You listen without leaning forward. You respond without urgency. You don't fill the silence for them anymore. And this unsettles them more than anger ever could, because anger would mean you still care in a way they recognize. Calm means you've found something stronger than attachment. It means you've chosen yourself. And suddenly, they're the one trying to bridge the distance. They're the one waiting for emotional access. They feel what you felt, and it's unbearable. The imbalance they once relied on has flipped, and now they understand the loneliness of reaching for someone who might not reach back. This is where they begin to beg, not always with words, but with energy, with effort they never showed before. They become attentive, curious, present. They remember details they once ignored. They show consistency they once avoided. Not because they've mastered emotional security overnight, but because loss has stripped away their defenses. They're terrified of losing you permanently, terrified that this is their last chance, terrified that even if you let them back in, they won't know how to stay without falling back into old patterns. That fear humbles them in ways growth never could. And yet, beneath the desperation, there is something genuine forming, an awareness they never had before. They finally understand that love isn't about control or distance. It's about staying when it's uncomfortable, about communicating instead of withdrawing, about choosing connection even when it activates old wounds. They see how much courage you had to love them without guarantees. And for the first time, they don't see your love as overwhelming. They see it as rare, sacred, something they were lucky to experience even once. Standing there now, emotionally exposed, they're no longer the person who walked away feeling relieved. They're someone who understands the cost of avoidance, someone who knows that running didn't save them, it delayed the inevitable reckoning. And as they look at you, unsure if you'll let them stay, they carry the weight of every moment they failed to show up. They're not asking to be rescued, they're asking to be seen fully, honestly, without armor. They stay longer this time, not physically at first, but emotionally. They don't disappear after the first vulnerable exchange. They don't retreat when things feel heavy, and this alone feels unfamiliar to them. Staying present feels like standing in a storm without armor. Every instinct tells them to shut down, to joke, to deflect, to minimize. But the fear of losing you again is stronger than the fear of being seen. So they sit in discomfort. They listen instead of preparing an escape. And in that stillness, something shifts. They begin to understand how much strength it took for you to do this for so long without guarantees. How many times you swallowed your fear just to keep the connection alive. That realization hurts in a new way. Not sharp, not dramatic, just deep, like pressure behind the heart. They start noticing the emotional distance they created everywhere in their life, not just with you. Old patterns suddenly make sense. how they left before being left, how they kept one foot out of every door, how they mistook numbness for peace. And now, with you standing in front of them, calm and grounded, they see what emotional maturity actually looks like. You're not chasing clarity. You're not demanding reassurance. You're not proving your worth. You're simply present. And this presence holds up a mirror they can no longer avoid. They see their fear clearly now. Fear of needing, fear of depending, fear of being known and still not chosen. These fears didn't start with you, but you were the first person who got close enough to trigger them. They want to explain themselves fully, but language fails them. Years of emotional suppression don't unravel neatly. Their apologies don't come out eloquent. They repeat themselves. They struggle to articulate feelings. They only recently allow themselves to feel. Sometimes they fall silent mid-thought, not because they don't care, but because vulnerability feels physically overwhelming. Their body reacts before their mind catches up. A tight chest, shallow breaths, a nervous energy they don't know how to release. And yet, they stay. They don't vanish to regulate alone like they used to. This alone is a quiet act of courage. They begin to understand something else that unsettles them deeply. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You're choosing whether to allow them back in, and this changes everything. Before, they held the power by withholding. Now power has shifted to presence, and presence belongs to you. They sense it in the way you don't rush to reassure them, in the way you allow silence without filling it, in the way you don't promise anything you can't feel. This forces them to confront a painful truth. They might have already lost you, not because you stopped caring, but because you started respecting yourself. And that possibility terrifies them more than abandonment ever did. Their desperation deepens, but it softens too. It's no longer about winning you back. It's about not repeating the same mistakes if they're given another chance. They start asking questions they never asked before. Not to control, but to understand. They ask what hurt you. They ask what you needed that you didn't receive. And hearing your truth is harder than they expected. Not because you're cruel, but because you're honest. Calmly honest. You don't accuse. You don't exaggerate. You simply state what it felt like to love someone who kept one foot out the door. And as they listen, shame rises. Not the toxic kind that makes them defensive, but the humbling kind that makes them quiet. They finally understand the emotional loneliness you lived in while standing right next to them. This is where something inside them truly breaks open. They stop defending their intentions. They stop explaining their fear. They stop minimizing your pain. And for the first time, they let themselves feel the full weight of what their avoidance cost you. They see how much you gave, how much you adjusted, how often you chose understanding over walking away. And they realize that your love wasn't weak. It was brave. It required emotional risk. They never learned how to take. This realization doesn't make them feel worthy. It makes them feel responsible. And responsibility is terrifying to someone who learned early that responsibility meant pressure, failure, or loss of self. They start to beg in ways that don't look dramatic from the outside, not grand gestures, not promises they can't keep, but consistency. Showing up when it's uncomfortable, responding, instead of retreating, staying engaged even when emotions rise. These small actions cost them more effort than anyone realizes. Every moment of presence feels like rewriting their nervous system. They're not just choosing you, they're choosing to unlearn survival patterns that once protected them. And they're afraid they'll fail again, afraid they'll disappoint you, afraid they'll revert to old habits the moment things feel intense, but they're more afraid of losing you permanently. They start to understand that love isn't about feeling safe all the time. It's about building safety together through honesty and repair. They see now that conflict didn't threaten the connection, avoidance did, silence did, distance did. And as this understanding settles, something unexpected happens. They feel closer to you than they ever did before. Not because things are easy, but because things are real. There's no illusion to hide behind anymore. Just two people standing in truth. And for someone who spent a lifetime running from emotional exposure, this closeness feels both terrifying and grounding. They begin to imagine a future differently now. not as something that traps them, but as something that could grow slowly, intentionally, with boundaries and communication. They don't fantasize about perfection. They fantasize about repair, about staying when things wobble, about speaking before disappearing, about choosing connection, even when fear whispers old lies. And they realize something else that hits them hard. You were never asking them to change who they were. You were asking them to stay present while being who they were. And that feels achievable now in a way it never did before. Still, doubt lingers. They know awareness doesn't erase patterns overnight. They know apology doesn't undo damage. They know trust takes time. They may not be given. And this uncertainty keeps them humble. They stop assuming access to you. They stop expecting forgiveness. They understand now that love doesn't mean entitlement, it means respect. And whether or not you choose to let them stay, they carry this truth with them that running didn't protect them. It only delayed the pain, and that the deepest connection they ever experienced came from someone who was brave enough to love them while they were still hiding. Standing here now, emotionally stripped of defenses, they are no longer begging to be saved. They're asking for the chance to show up differently, to stay when fear rises, to choose presence over protection, to meet you where you are instead of pulling you toward where they feel safe. And they know something with painful clarity. If you walk away now, they will finally understand why, not as rejection, but as consequence. And that understanding will stay with them forever. They wait now in a way they never did before, not impatient, not entitled, just present. They don't rush you to decide. They don't push for reassurance. They finally understand that urgency is not intimacy, that pressure is not love, and this waiting is agony for them. Because every second of uncertainty forces them to sit with the consequences of their past distance. They feel the vulnerability they once avoided living inside their body without distraction. They don't know if you'll choose them. They don't know if this moment is a beginning or a quiet ending. And for the first time, they let themselves feel that fear fully instead of numbing it. This is where real change begins. Not with promises, not with words, but with the ability to stay emotionally present even when the outcome is uncertain. They notice how differently you hold yourself now. You're softer, but stronger, open, but not exposed, loving, but not self-abandoning. And they realize something that cuts deep. You didn't harden because of them. You evolved. You learned how to love without losing yourself, and that growth happened while they were gone. This realization brings a complicated mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that you became this grounded version of yourself. Sorrow that they weren't emotionally capable of growing alongside you at the time. They see now that love doesn't wait forever. It transforms, and if someone can't meet it where it's grown, it leaves them behind. They begin to understand that even if you choose them again, it will not be the same relationship. And strangely, that doesn't scare them as much as it once would have, because the old dynamic depended on imbalance, on you, and them retreating, on you carrying the emotional weight while they stayed protected. That dynamic can't exist anymore. You won't allow it. And they know it, so the begging shifts. It's no longer about getting the old connection back. It's about asking if they're allowed to build something new, something slower, something honest, something that doesn't require you to shrink so they can feel safe. They finally say the things they once avoided saying out loud, not dramatically, not perfectly, but truthfully, that they were scared, that closeness overwhelmed them, that they didn't know how to ask for space without disappearing, that they confused emotional distance with self-protection, that they didn't understand how much pain silence could cause, and as these words leave their mouth, something inside them releases, not because everything is fixed, but because they're no longer lying to themselves. This honesty cost them their old identity. The one that said they were fine alone. The one that said they didn't need deep connection. The one that said leaving with strength. That identity dissolves here. They see clearly now that you weren't trying to trap them. You weren't demanding perfection. You weren't asking them to be someone else. You were asking them to be present, to communicate, to stay. And that request felt impossible back then, because it required emotional skills. They never learned. This understanding doesn't excuse their behavior. It contextualizes it. And in that context, they finally forgive themselves enough to change. Not to erase the past, but to stop repeating it. The regret they feel now is different from earlier regret. It's not panicked, it's sober, grounded. They understand that even if you don't choose them again, this experience has altered them permanently. They will never again confuse numbness with peace. They will never again believe that love should feel distant to be safe. They will carry the memory of losing you as a lesson written into their nervous system. And that lesson hurts, but it also anchors them. When they beg now, it's quiet. It's in the way they show up consistently without being asked, in the way they listen without interrupting, in the way they respect your boundaries without resentment, in the way they don't rush healing or demand reassurance. This begging isn't about desperation anymore. It's about humility, about recognizing that access to you is not guaranteed, that love is a privilege, not a right, and that realization changes how they move through the world. They see something else now too, that you staying or leaving is not a reflection of their worth, but of timing, readiness, and alignment. This is the hardest truth for them to accept because their old pattern relied on external validation to feel safe. But now they're learning to self-regulate without disappearing, to feel fear without fleeing, to love without controlling the distance. And whether or not they get another chance with you, this growth is real, earned through loss, not comfort. If you choose to walk away, they will finally understand why you had to, not as punishment, not as betrayal, but as self-respect. And that understanding will stay with them longer than any relationship ever did. If you choose to stay, they know the work is only beginning. That trust will rebuild slowly. That consistency matters more than intensity. That presence matters more than promises. And for the first time, they're willing to do that work without running. This is the quiet ending no one talks about. The moment where the avoidant doesn't win or lose, but wakes up, where the relief of distance is replaced by the responsibility of connection, where love is no longer something to escape from, but something to meet honestly. They don't stand in front of you as someone superior or healed. They stand as someone aware, someone changed, someone who finally understands what it cost to lose you. And whether you open the door or close it gently, one truth remains: they will never forget you. Not because you were perfect, but because you loved them while they were hiding. And that kind of love leaves a mark that avoidance can't erase.